So, how many people here are congressional staffers? Anybody? Okay. How many folks are practitioners of one kind or another, of some integrative kind of healthcare discipline? Oh, okay, so this is the home crowd. So, okay, well this is good because I get to amend a little bit of what I was otherwise going to say. Moment of background. So I was trained in neuropharmacology. I used to work for a drug company doing research when I was 18 years old. And I always describe that experience as when I was 19, I was more interested in monkeys than girls. So if you ever get to meet my wife, you'll have to ask her how the hell she ever endured. And was elected to the New York Academy of Sciences when I was 19 as a student member. Was invited to Roger Sperry's lab at Caltech. Roger Sperry won the Nobel Prize in Medicine. 6 years later, he was really one of the first ones to articulate the differences between the right and left halves of the brain. I eventually got out of science and got into finance and was working in the pension world, mostly because it kept my brain busy. And it turns out that I had enough insight that I thought that was a good idea. I eventually, working in the pension space, developed the first pension fund fiduciary training program in the United States. So it speaks probably volumes as to why pensions in this country look the way they do, because my dog requires more licensing than someone who manages $1 billion of somebody else's money. And I put together a training program that was based off of a principle of, if you were going to do this job by honoring the duty, what would you do? And then contrast that to, you probably learned to do the job by paying attention to what the attorneys told you to do where you work. And that's not like a bad thing, because their job is to keep you out of trouble. But the distinction between those two lenses as to how you would look at the task was actually pretty dramatic. And then there was one last question, which was, what were the obstacles between doing it the way that would honor the duty and the way that you had learned to do it? So we became known as offering an authentic training program, and an organization called Financial Executives International, headquartered in New Jersey, endorsed our training. They asked me to run around the country at that point to teach CFOs what the difference between the way they had learned it and honoring the duty was. That was really quite an instructive exercise to sit in front of, I don't know, 500 or 600 CFOs. I'm going to cut the story short a bit. So I eventually got to do some work for some very large companies in the United States. For the government of Dubai, the government of Jordan, and eventually the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve asked me to construct a fiduciary training program for bank examiners throughout the entire system in 2007. And let's just say they didn't listen. So, that being said, I had all along been involved as an advisor to various biomedical device companies because they like to have finance folks around, and with my background in finance and neuropharmacology a little odd, I had an experience, and I'll pass this around. It's my only copy on me. I didn't really bring it for the purposes of sharing it around, or which I had people be able to take it. But this is a copy of it's an infrared photograph of an 82-year-old man who was wheeled into in a wheelchair to a doctor's offices. Kind of classic presentation: congestive heart failure, high blood pressure, diabetes, diabetic neuropathy, on 9 different drugs, taking insulin, shooting insulin in the morning and at night. This guy mostly lived in a wheelchair. He could walk to that door, but it would take him like 20 minutes or so to do that. And he was treated with an optical device that shot infrared light into acupuncture points behind his knees and around his ankle. And as you can see from the photograph as it makes its way around the room, the blood perfusion in his legs changed dramatically with the introduction of the light therapy. The nerves clearly weren't dead, they were just turned off. If you come from my training in classical neurosciences, a turned off nerve doesn't make a damn lick of sense. So, and I had heard of acupuncture like a lot of people, but didn't know much about it, and I didn't know what an infrared photon was either. So that began my journey of 10 years of studying biophysics and eventually meeting my dear friend Jim. And that was my father. So my father, aside from walking a mile the next day, never needed insulin again. And there is, in fact, one case history in PubMed that details a similar kind of experience with someone, a woman in her mid-50s, as I recall. But you couldn't find anything in the literature on how do you treat people with light therapy and get rid of their diabetes. In fact, the question of if he didn't need insulin and the diabetic neuropathy was gone, did he still have diabetes, is actually an interesting question in and of its own right. So that began my journey into a world that I didn't know existed. And it was a world in which I went from integrative medicine office to integrative medicine office and talked to MDs and DOs and acupuncturists and people who did, I'll just say with my training, unusual things. And noticed that the patient outcomes were spectacular, as a rule of thumb. So the next, being a finance guy, I consulted when in my fiduciary consulting capacity on about $100 billion around the world. And so the next simple question was, if this stuff works, why is it not being used? So now you had to take a deep dive into this arcane world of the finance of healthcare, because no matter what anyone says, it really is actually all about the money. And it's kind of interesting because while everyone can say that, not very many people can describe how does the money flow. Because it's not actually about the money, it's how it flows that counts. So we began to take apart the nature of the cash flow that backed up all these activities that led to a kind of a dysfunctional healthcare system in which things that worked weren't used. And we began to tease the Gordian knot apart piece by piece for the purposes of building a business model that we could take out to the marketplace so you could drive efficiency and effectiveness into the healthcare spending from large companies. Why? Because CFOs, unless they're the CFO of a monopoly, hate monopolies. And so it turns out it's much better to have the conversation with people that hated monopolies than the people who ran them. And they had, for a very long period of time, driven efficiency and effectiveness using various methodologies into their conflicted supply chains in manufacturing and in a whole bunch of other services in a whole bunch of different disciplines. But they never did it in healthcare. And that was sort of interesting to me. And I will relate one conversation that I had with a gentleman after working with his employer in getting them to change their behavior and how they manage $20 billion in ERISA assets, retirement assets. And the conversation went something like this. Jim had been in the room for the presentation. We presented sort of this model of, well, you know, if you do this pilot project in biophysics therapies, you're going to save yourself a lot of money. And what came back was, sorry, Wayne, we only practice evidence-based medicine. I had actually never heard the term before. So I was a scientist, I was a finance guy. You take a deep dive into the notion of evidence-based medicine, and it kind of looks like green. Or it kind of looks like love, or beauty, or makeup, or something like that, in which it really means nothing. And so I went back to this gentleman who already knew that I worked with the board of directors of this Fortune 50 company and said, Tom, now that you practice evidence-based medicine, and this is a very large company, and now that you spend $1 billion on healthcare, what does your data tell you about what you pay for that works and what you pay for that doesn't? And he said something that floored me. He said, we don't have any data. And I was like, wait a minute, let me make sure I got this. You, Tom, authorized the company to spend $1 billion out of this company's coffers, and you don't have a basis for why? That's right. Does your CFO know that? No. What do you think he'd say if he found out? Oh, he wouldn't be happy. So I was sort of shaken to my boots on that one because I couldn't believe that somehow no one in this gigantic company had figured this out. And then I had the chance to sit with, I'll just say, a member of the core team that worked on the passage of Obamacare, and he's a finance gentleman, and said, told him, related the experience, and he said, yeah, it works like that. They just have no idea. And then I sat with someone else who's involved in corporate governance and said, so what do you call a board of directors of a publicly traded company that allows management to spend $1 billion a year on a conflicted supply chain, has no data and basis for why, and does it again next year? So you see, you call it a lawsuit waiting to happen because it's a breach of fiduciary duty under Delaware Chancellery law. So I'm just putting pieces of this together, right, going, you got to be kidding me. You got to be kidding me. I just didn't believe it. But of course I had had the experience with the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, so I was willing to believe almost anything that I wouldn't believe before. And Jim and I had an experience sitting with, I'll say, a senior member of HHS. This is months after Obamacare passed, and we went in with a four-star general, excuse me, it was a one-star general, who was an MD and involved in military health care, and we did a download for someone at a senior role in HHS. Jim made an impassioned storytelling about biophysics and how valuable it can be. The general talked about the applications for military health care, and I sort of ended the presentation and said, how do we work with you? Now mind you, this is, to be fair, it was before even the ACO rules came out, and no one quite knew what Obamacare meant as a practical matter, and this gentleman looked up from his papers and said, we don't have a way to pay for things that work. And this is being taped, so I won't repeat what Jim said about that, but I will say that it was another one of those moments where the finance guy in me is, it's like, you got to be kidding me. So then you take a deep dive into why would he say that, and what are the obstacles to paying for something that works. So I won't go into the deeper side of the story, but suffice to say you get the idea that we had some pretty good guidance as to what were the obstacles, what were the challenges, what were the finance obstacles, how do you get past those. And the goal was always to construct a business model that we could take out to the marketplace to institutionalize integrative medicine. We started with how do you institutionalize biophysics-based medicine. It turns out we have various PhDs from very honorable institutions, if there is such a thing, then told us that we shouldn't actually use that word because it scares people. So, it's like astronomy scaring people. I'm not sure why that would be, but it does, I guess. And so we decided that we were going to sort of drop the word biophysics and we would use the word physics-based therapies, because people would have to begin to ask us the question, what's a physics-based therapy? It's like, well, physics has been in medicine for 115 years since the first X-ray, and then there's these other things that have a place in physics and diagnostics. We just want to move it into therapeutics. And we would have conversations with doctors, conventionally trained physicians that would go like this, and I met a bunch. What would you think, Doc, if we told you you could put somebody into a big magnet, you could electrify the magnet, you could have small little magnets that would kind of calibrate the big electrical field, and you could see inside their body? And they'd look at us like, that's ridiculous. You ever order an MRI? So we would have these conversations like, you already know how to apply these principles, you're just not applying them therapeutically. And but we ran into this problem called physics is pretty damn difficult. And if you talk to a physicist, and I just came from Caltech last week, where there was a conference on the physics of water, I met May Wan Ho. When you sit with physicists, you gotta love these people, because mostly they go, we don't know. It's always good when you can get someone to admit we don't know. So we realized that we didn't yet have the business model, because physics therapeutics is quite a challenging topic to be able to bring to people who aren't trained in physics. And I had a moment somewhere in there, I will say another key moment for me, that was the person in me trained as a pharmacologist, in which we looked at the carrier, the molecular structure of how a molecule would interact with a cell membrane. And we always thought it was about the molecular structure. And somewhere in there, partly at Jim's coaching, I got to realize that it wasn't the carrier of the signal, it was the signal. That was a new one on me. You have to excuse me, I was a little slow. I was trained as a pharmacologist. And so I now felt like the story was complete. And what we have now come to is a business model in which we are institutionalizing integrative medicine. So that really has to do with it begins with having a way of capturing what do integrative practitioners do. That requires a procedural coding system that can capture that information. It requires having some framework for being able to capture outcomes. And then it requires centralizing the framework for that data collection, because now you have a repository of data which you can then use to do something like this. And this may not be a great example for the folks in the room, but for anyone else ever listening to this, it would look like the opportunity of a centralized repository for integrative medicine will allow you to say something like, wow, you know, integrative medicine practitioners are out there. We noticed you have 18 ways of dealing with diabetes. And we noticed from looking at the data that there seem to be 5 that are particularly effective. Here's the data on the 5 protocols that are particularly effective. Could you see if you could improve upon them? We will capture that data. We will take that data to corporate finance and say, how'd you like to pay for something that's more effective? So now the good news is we got a lot of companies listening. Why? Well, because I can speak finance speak. And it's really not that hard. It's because they're busy people. They just want to know that they can mostly save money, and if you can save money and help people get better faster, they're all over that, because they actually would like to see that happen. And one of the obstacles that they've had is no way to collect data. They're surrounded by consultants from consulting firms and conventionally trained MDs who, when they sit back and say, you know, we spend $1 billion here, isn't there anything we can do? Usually the people sitting around the table go, no. And so if you're a CFO and you're busy and you're running the finance organization for a company that does business in 40 countries, and you've got a bunch of smart people sitting around the table and they go, there's nothing you can do, you tend to believe them. Unless, of course, you've had an experience with integrative medicine, and then you know that you're surrounded by the wrong people. So my job was to find them, and we have. So I'm pleased to say that we have a letter of intent coming, God willing, from one of the largest employers in the United States to transform their workers' compensation program using integrative medicine. It is not my job to find practitioners to do a certain thing. It is my job to find the practitioners who will allow us to capture the data. They do what they do, and we will let the data be used in a kind of comparative effectiveness analysis. So for any given diagnostic code, you'll be able to see how does conventional care treated, how does integrative medicine treated, and the numbers will shake out on their own. And piece by piece, you build a value-based payment system, which as far as I can tell is the holy grail, quantified, evidence-based, patient-centric, and driven by finance who would like to see efficiency and effectiveness into how they apply their working capital. And that's my whole story.
Fantastic.